Showboat. With Showboat, the musical theater in America acquires a new dimension, because this isn't just musical comedy. In fact, there's not much comedy about it, although it was called that and designated that by its authors. This is musical drama. This is a piece with a real artistic entity. One of the most important things about Showboat, and there are many, is that it has a certain thematic unity. You're looking at a piece that's about something, and it's about something throughout the piece, so that almost every part of the show in the play is a symbol that supports that basic message of the show. Secondly, the message of the show is, well, it's about race. It's a show really that dares to take a look at America and take a look at social inequality and say that these things exist, and not just build off of the concept that a musical is an escape. A lot of pieces up to this point have this theory, and it's probably still a valid one even today, that we go to the theater to get away from our problems. We go to the theater to be distracted from whatever's wrong with society. Some people believe that we go to the theater and the theater has a responsibility to point out what's wrong with society, and that it has a responsibility to engage the audience and to challenge the audience and to say, this is a problem and we should face it together. That's a show like Showboat. Showboat is really very much not only about racism in America, but the notion of covering it up. The notion of covering up a lot of things. The notion that when bad things happen that are societally ill, that we can do two things. We can do something about it, or we can just bury it and hope that if we move along, that it'll just go away, if we just ignore it long enough. And that's the real message and symbol, a dangerous one in 1927. Speaking of dangerous things in 1927, Showboat is also the first show, get this, to have African-American actors playing African-American characters interspersed with non-African-American characters. In other words, a mixed race cast on stage, and everybody is playing the actual race that they are. A bad side and a really embarrassing part of the vaudeville era is the minstrel show. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing about the minstrel shows, which featured broad caricatures of African-American characters, and huge racist stereotypes. Some of it was because some vaudeville producers had come across uniquely African-American art forms in entertainment, gospel music, jazz music, tap dancing, and said, we should incorporate this. But rather than desegregate, rather than bring on actual African-American performers, a lot of those vaudeville houses said, let's just get white performers and make them up and have them pretend to be black. And from that leads to these broad caricatures and these really embarrassing racial parodies that went on. And that part of the vaudeville show was a part of it for almost its entire history, right into the 1940s. Very embarrassing. With Showboat, the people behind it, particularly its producer, its writers, Kern and a man named Oscar Hammerstein, said, we want actual black actors to play these characters. Not only that, they felt that they were doing these actors a bit of a service, not because they were played as saintly characters, but because they were played as characters who have their good days and their bad days, who are three-dimensional real people with serious problems. And by bringing their problems to the stage as well, Hammerstein especially felt that he was doing a service to both the audience and the performers. Showboat is based on a novel by a woman named Edna Ferber. The actual creative team we're looking at on Showboat, Jerome Kern, who we've been talking about a lot tonight. The lyrics are by a man named Oscar Hammerstein. We sometimes refer to him as Oscar Hammerstein II, or Oscar Hammerstein Jr. Oscar Hammerstein Sr. was also involved in the theater, primarily as a producer and as a sort of a landlord. He owned a lot of buildings and invested a lot of money in a lot of theater, and was really good at putting art together and putting shows together on a big, broad scale. He was a businessman, primarily. His son, Oscar Hammerstein Jr., is probably most familiar to you as one half of the songwriting team of Rodgers and Hammerstein. They get their own unit later on in our class. Rodgers and Hammerstein gave us The Sound of Music and The King and I, South Pacific, and yes, Oklahoma. Hammerstein is probably one of the major lyricists of the 20th century. And he also was a major shaping force, almost a parental figure, for young Stephen Joshua Sondheim. Hammerstein pretty much acted as a father figure to him and taught him, according to Sondheim, everything he knows. And then you have Edna Ferber, Ferber, who had also written a novel called Giant, which became a very big hit film with James Dean much later, was famous for these big, fat, epic, doorstop length kind of novels. And when Hammerstein approached her and said, I think your novel would be interesting as a stage play, she sort of laughed in his face. She didn't stop him. She said, good luck, but she was convinced it would fail. Hammerstein was the real original, he started the idea of working on Showboat. He went to Ferber first. He found Kern. He said, you know, I've heard great things about these Princess Theater shows you've done and all of this character development. How do you like to get back to a show that has a great big giant budget and has an enormous set, but still holds on to those principles of having real, honest human characters? And, for good measure, we're going to try and do something about social justice. We're going to try and say something with a real serious message here. Well, that's a whole lot to sell somebody. The guy they wound up selling it to was a man named Florence, or in some cases they refer to him as Flo Ziegfeld. Florence Ziegfeld was the producer of, among other things, the Ziegfeld Follies, a show which basically had lots and lots of pretty attractive women in lots of expensive, fancy costumes, descending down flights of stairs to songs that were sung by crooner-type performers, a medley of things, not really a plot. The Follies was really designed to be, if anything, the ultimate fluff piece. And yet when these three go to Flo Ziegfeld and say, you've got a building that's big enough to perhaps house what we have in mind for Showboat, Ziegfeld, I couldn't tell you why, says, sure, I'll take a giant chance with this. Even though it doesn't have a chorus of chorus girls and pretty people singing and dancing, even though it has one of the most depressing plots you're going to hear in a musical, even though it's going to cost an exorbitant amount of money, and even though it's dealing with people who have only up until now done smaller projects, Ziegfeld takes an enormous chance. In fact, he bumps another show that's supposed to go into his theater to put Showboat on instead. And to everyone's surprise, Showboat is perhaps the biggest hit of the 20th century, certainly one of the biggest hits of the 1920s. I'm going to try here and give you a plot synopsis of Showboat. I'm not going to give you the whole thing. It is big, it is epic, and it has, over the years, evolved a little bit. If any of you have seen a recent revival of Showboat, not much of it changes, but places here and there. The basic concept of it, though, remains the same. And I think, although I'm not going to do this for an awful lot of shows that we deal with, I think for Showboat, it's important because it helps us to understand this, this thematic unity that I talked about in the last section. The story takes place over the span of many years, from about 1880 to about 1920, mostly on the Mississippi River. On the Mississippi, there were, well, showboats, literally large paddle-wheeled boats that would come from city to city. A lot of cities in the middle of America and the American West had ordinances that you couldn't do certain things on city soil or on their property, but there was no ordinance against doing anything on the water. And so an awful lot of these showboats would come into town, drop a gangplank, and offer gambling, and offer shows that had material that might be too racy otherwise, that would offer alcoholic drinks and things like that. Whatever the case may be, they could also, if the heat got a little bit too much in that village, pull up the gangplank and just kind of move on to the next town. That concept of just keeps rolling along is actually a big piece of the plot to Showboat and a lot of the metaphor that the show contains. The Showboat is run primarily by a guy named Captain Andy. He's one of these people who's sunny and pleasant in disposition and does an awful lot to try to say, oh, let's just not talk about that really confrontational, unpleasant thing. He thinks the world particularly of his daughter Magnolia. He thinks that Magnolia, the sun rises and sets on her, he dotes upon her. We don't really meet Magnolia's mother, and we don't talk about that tragedy, whatever it may have been, very much either. Magnolia has a boyfriend, and his name is Gaylord. Now, Gaylord has, among other traits, a gambling problem, a serious one. The kind of problem where he steals money from people, where he borrows money from people, where he disappears for sometimes days on end, and no one quite knows where he is. But he's attractive, he's pleasant, he's good looking and charming, and Magnolia kind of tries to see past the bad side, the addiction and the dangerous side of Gaylord. He has a song called Only Make Believe that he sings with her, in which the two sort of have a flirtatious exchange of how we can make believe I love you and make believe that everything is just perfect. On the boat, we have two performers who sing in an act as entertainers, a couple named Julie and Steve. A rumor starts in one of the towns that perhaps Julie is of mixed race, that she has both black and white blood in her, and that she should not be allowed to perform. Some even suggest that this rumor comes from Julie not being willing to, well, be more than an entertainer with some of these people. In any case, Steve very quickly grabs a hold of her hand, pricks it with a pin, puts her finger in his mouth and says, well, if she has black blood, then so do I. And if you're gonna have to fire her, you're gonna have to fire me too. At that point, Steve comes off a little bit strong, but ultimately he sort of has feet of clay and he doesn't really hang on beyond this rather strong moment. There are African-American characters who work on the boat, Joe and Queenie. In fact, it's the fact that Julie and Queenie are sort of singing songs together in the hold of the ship that make people think that Julie must be either black or have some sort of sensibilities that this town doesn't stand for in associating with her. Queenie has problems of her own because her husband Joe, he's a strong man. He's a good man in many ways, but there's something implied that Joe has an edge, has a darker side as well. Joe sings songs and relates speeches where he feels that as a black man, and very probably right, he's been taken advantage of so much that he's just going to do only as much as is necessary to get by. He'll never give anybody more than that. He complains about how the river, in a song that many people confuse for a legitimate spiritual, it's not. It's a show tune written by Misters Kern and Hammerstein. But Old Man River just keeps rolling along. A song that I'm going to attach in one of the links to today's lecture is, you can hear the fury and the pain underneath the notion that this is also a beautiful song. In any case, Queenie sings about Joe, a song called Can't Help Lovin' That Man. Now that song, in case you haven't heard it, and I'm also going to attach that song as well, has become a bit of a jazz standard. You'll hear renditions of this song by Helen Morgan, by Ella Fitzgerald, by Billie Holiday. And ultimately, the song is fascinating because out of context, many of you may have already heard it and thought that it had this truly, and I guess it does, romantic sort of sentiment. He can come home as late as he wants. He can do whatever he wants, but I can't help it, I have to love him anyway. But when you think about it, that's Queenie also saying, well, as she says in the song, I even love him when his kisses got gin. She basically says if he is abusive, if he is drunk, if he is coming home late at night and not doing the things that he's supposed to, that she's obligated to be with him. Well, Julie eventually, because Captain Andy does not want any trouble, Julie and Steve get fired and they get removed from the boat. The boat pulls up without them and Magnolia is put on stage and made into a performer in her own right. She's a little nervous about that at first, but ultimately she decided that she can investigate that. Gaylord disappears, this time for a much longer period of time. And Magnolia goes out to look for him. What she finds at one point ashore, on the shoreline, is a very despondent Julie. Steve may have been strong when we last saw him, but he couldn't handle it after a while, and he himself had left her and disappeared. Julie goes on to, depending on the way that you read the script, to either feign drunkenness so that Magnolia can get a chance at getting a job, or is drunk and has descended into some form of alcoholism. And basically, rather than say to Magnolia, you should forget Gaylord, the basic sentiment seems to be you should still go after him because at least he's better than nothing. And that really dark sentiment is not really addressed beyond the idea that the show must go on and the boat must roll forward and it just continues on after that. Sadder but wiser, Magnolia is found by her father and they are reunited at the curtains fall at the end of the show. But now here's a show that deals with, among other things, spousal abuse, gambling, alcoholism, racism. All of these incredibly dark and very important topics are being dealt with, and the show comes out in 1927. Showboat has been successfully revived in every decade since it was first presented, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way through to the 20-teens. At least once every 10 years, there's a new production of Showboat. The interesting thing is that with each new production, I think an awful lot of people say, oh, they must have darkened this up, they must have added some material. to make it more, more today, but they didn't. Most of Showboat is still most of Showboat. In 1954, Showboat made its first appearance as an opera in an opera repertory when the New York City Opera decided that it was, well, operatic in nature, and that it deserved a higher type of audience. For Kern, Showboat becomes just a treasure trove of successful songs, because the genius of the songs, as I mentioned earlier with Can't Help Loving That Man, is that a lot of them outside of context, you take them out of the context and you just play them, and it's fascinating because they seem to work as independent love songs without the plot. Add the plot, sometimes they mean something entirely different than what they meant when things were originally put together for them. There's an awful lot of other material that Kern would go on to write, but he never quite got out of the shadow of Showboat. He wound up working revivals of it and looking at it in different angles all over the years and commenting on it. In the mid-1940s, Kern suffered a heart attack and was taken into the hospital. This part of the story is what you might call a segue. It's a young man who got in to see Kern in the hospital and said, kind of grabbed some way of whether taking an orderly's coat or an ID or something, and snuck into the hospital room. And Kern, recovering, but probably not long for this world nonetheless, met this young man, and he said, listen, I'm your biggest fan. I saw Showboat, I saw the Princess stuff, I think you're a genius, and I think that everything you've done has been so influential, and I knew that you were in the hospital somewhere near where I lived, so I took this, I hope you'll forgive me, I took this opportunity to come in here and see you. Now, I should add that that young man was not particularly, it's not like he was a complete stranger to Kern. Okay, he was Irving Berlin. And Berlin was already up and coming as a songwriter in his own right, and would become one of the most important composers ever of popular music. And Kern said, well, I don't know if I'm going to make it. And he was right, he didn't. But he said, I'm working on a piece right now with some other people, and maybe if you want to take over for me and write it in my place, you'd probably be a pretty good person. Tell them I recommended you. That piece, called Annie Get Your Gun, turned out to be a big hit for Irving Berlin. I sometimes wonder if it would have been a very different show if Jerome Kern had actually written it along the style of Showboat, but I guess that's for another, some parallel world to find out. In any case, Jerome Kern, after his death in 1945, Showboat, like I said, was elevated to the status of being part of the repertoire of the New York Opera in 1954, and became one of the great American treasures. And even had Kern not written other really great songs, like The Way You Look Tonight, and some other really popular hit tunes from the swing era, I think a lot of us would still say just this alone is enough to make him perhaps one of the real giants of the stage. When we have our next meeting, I guess, however you want to call it, we'll be talking specifically about Irving Berlin, who rose from Tin Pan Alley to become almost a one-man institution and wrote some of the great individual popular songs of the early 20th century, and then eventually a couple of the really great musicals. So there will be, just taking care of a little bit of business here. We've had all sorts of problems with quizzes. I apologize for that, and with getting things posted out here. I'm glad and thankful that you've been sticking with it. For those of you who have had questions and problems with the quiz, I will be adjusting those so that everyone has, no one has anything to worry about there. And I'm going to try to create a more open-ended quiz and attach it either to tonight's lecture. If you don't see it, it'll be attached to the very next one that will cover things and ask you to talk about from vaudeville up until whatever that point is. So thanks again for sticking with us, and I hope you're having a good experience, and we'll talk to you the next time. Thank you.